Well, good Saturday evening. Meteorologist Evan Stewart here. Thank you for joining us here on Hurricane Hub Live. This is where we track the tropics. We do it every day at 8 p.m. Give you an update on what's brewing in the Atlantic, occasionally the Pacific, depending on how active the Atlantic is. And the Atlantic is a little bit active. We have a tropical storm out there. That's Tropical Storm Gabrielle, just on the verge of becoming a hurricane. So we'll have an update on that. There's one other area that we're watching in the eastern Atlantic. Things have been quiet. We went through a stretch of very quiet weather in the Atlantic and not much development right around the peak of hurricane season, which is typically September 10th. Now we're about a week to 10 days after that, and we're finally starting to see what will likely be our second hurricane of the year. That is Gabrielle, that is out here in the Atlantic. Pretty easy to see. Now, that wasn't the case yesterday. It wasn't a very well organized system at all, but we've really seen a flare up of thunderstorm activity around the center. Yesterday, it was encountering some western shear where the winds in the upper parts of the atmosphere were sort of blowing those thunderstorm tops off of the top of the tropical storm. And that's why we didn't really have that nice picture here showing up on the satellite view, which we're finally starting to see. You'll also notice this line of clouds, that's a cold front. That's what's going to keep it away from the eastern United States and even the island of Bermuda, as it is going to be picked up by this front and accelerate quickly off towards the north. But again, things are quiet through the Caribbean and into the Gulf, and then we have another wave that we'll mention. I'll talk about that a little bit later out here in the eastern Atlantic. But this is Gabrielle. Again, much better organized than what it was looking a couple of days ago, and you can see sort of that outflow up along the tops of those thunderstorms, those high thin cirrus clouds. And you have to think of these tropical systems like a chimney, and they have to be able to vent themselves. And that's what we're seeing now. We're finally able to see those thunderstorms fire up a little bit closer to the center. It's still a little bit displaced on the eastern side, but it is now looking much more like a tropical system than what we were seeing this time yesterday. And as I mentioned, the Hurricane Hunter aircraft have been flying around in the storm. There was one a little bit earlier that found 54-mile-per-hour winds. One earlier today found the winds a little bit stronger, and that's why there was a 2 o'clock supplemental advisory that was issued by the Hurricane Center, because those winds came up to 65 miles per hour based on some of the surveys from the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. Now, that was one a little bit earlier today. You can see around 2, 3 o'clock this afternoon. There's been another mission that has flown out there this evening, and you'll notice it does a little bit different. Let's go back to the other one. And you can see this does a little crisscross pattern, and when we have a hurricane, you can see them go through the eye several times. So that was the one earlier today. This is the one this evening. And you'll notice while it does go through the center, it sort of surveys the area ahead of the storm. And that's very important too, because we have to know what the conditions are like, where the storm is heading. And all that information goes into the computer models that help us make that forecast that tells us where the storm will go. So it's not just where the storm is located, but what's the environment like around the storm. And remember, in the middle of the ocean, it's very different than we have on land. You know, we have airports and observation sites all over the United States and all over the world, but we don't have a lot of information out over the ocean. Remember, 3/4 of the earth just about is water. So we have buoys that are out there, but they're fairly far dispersed, and other than some ship or aircraft reports, there's not a lot of information that comes in over the open waters. That's why we rely on satellite and these Hurricane Hunter aircraft to fly into the storm and survey the area around it. Based on all that information, Gabrielle, which right now is about 580 miles there southeast of the island of Bermuda, has 65-mile-per-hour winds. This is the 5 o'clock advisory. There was no intermediate 8 o'clock advisory because there was no significant change in the strength of the storm. So we'll get another update at 11 o'clock. I don't expect too much of a change. I think we will see a hurricane by tomorrow, and that's what the forecast is calling for. Maybe late tonight, but I think more likely tomorrow we'll see what will become a minimal Category 1 hurricane, winds around 85 miles per hour, and then it's in a fairly favorable area for development as we get into Monday here east of the island of Bermuda, likely becoming a Category 2 hurricane. There were some signs earlier. Some of the computer models were saying it might even be able to reach major category strength or Category 3. Doesn't look like that's in the cards now. And then that front that I was mentioning, that is just going to carry this storm quickly off towards the east. So you notice by Thursday out here towards the Azores, that's Europe over there. So it is going to move quickly off into the North Atlantic. There will still be some impacts, though. It is going to pass east of Bermuda, and of course well east of the United States. but it is going to send some swells towards the islands. Now, I mentioned those computer models. Here are all those computer models. This is the official Hurricane Center cone. And you can see, other than a couple of stray ones in here, all the models are pretty much in agreement where the hurricane is going to go. And that's certainly good news for our confidence in the forecast that it is going to curve here well east of Bermuda. Notice a couple of the models do bring it a little bit closer. And all of these computer models use different equations and different formulas and different algorithms to sort of make that prediction of where the storm will go. And you can see some of them start the storm in a little bit of a different place. But again, with that consensus, it is pretty likely that this storm is going to pass east of Bermuda and quickly move out into the Atlantic, and that's what we're thinking, certainly. Now, I mentioned that there will be some impacts. Now, here in eastern Virginia and North Carolina tomorrow, we already have a high risk of rip currents. Here we come into the last weekend here of astronomical summer. We've got some northeast winds coming in. We've had a cold front move through, looking at surf height of 3 to 5 feet. Some folks will still be out there trying to get in some last beach days along the ocean front. It'll be cooler in the 70s, but that high threat of rip current. And that's going to continue through much of this week, not just because we have those northeast winds, but eventually some of those swells from Hurricane Gabrielle will work their way towards the east coast. So really from North Carolina all the way up towards Maine. And you can see here as we get into the day tomorrow, that high rip current risk here, Virginia Beach down through the Outer Banks, up along the eastern shore, the Delmarva into New Jersey, moderate risk as you head out towards Long Island, and also down here south of Hatteras. And this rip current risk is going to continue as we go through this week because eventually those swells will propagate towards the coastline, and that'll increase our threat of rip currents as well. It's not going to have a significant impact on any kind of overwash or anything like that, like we saw with Aaron a few weeks ago, because the storm is just way out there, again, east of Bermuda, but certainly something that we will continue to watch very closely. Now, coming up, we'll talk about what else is brewing in the Atlantic, and we'll have a little brief check on the Pacific. So don't go away. Hurricane Hub Live will be back after this quick break. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live. We talked about Gabrielle, which you can see here spinning here towards the middle of the screen, but there are a couple other waves that are out there that we're watching. One that has a little bit of a chance of development over the coming days. As a matter of fact, the National Hurricane Center is giving it a 20% chance of development over the next week. Now, when we talk about the National Weather Service, there are a lot of different parts to the National Weather Service. You have your local offices, part of the National Weather Service. Those are the folks out in Wakefield, if you've ever been out along 460, heading up towards Wakefield, the Virginia Diner. You've seen that big radome out there, the radar. That is the National Weather Service. Information for the hurricanes comes from the National Hurricane Center, and they're the ones who put out this forecast that goes out for 1 week. So you can see that this wave right now, next couple of days, so this takes us into the early part of next week, 0% chance of development. Not a very favorable area. The thought is that once we get beyond, that 2-day forecast, this area, which pretty much right on the heels of where Gabrielle is, a little bit of a better chance for development. Still low at 20% chance, but a chance nonetheless. We'll watch that as we go over the coming days. So again, this is from the National Hurricane Center. Another branch of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, of which National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service are all a part of, is the Climate Prediction Center. And they do a little bit of a different forecast. And they do this every Tuesday. It's sent out. So this is for the 24th through the 30th. Today is the 20th. So this goes out, 4 days and then 11 days from now. And you can see here that they also have this area as a low chance of development for tropical systems. So that sort of lines up to what the Hurricane Center is saying. Low odds, but chance nonetheless. So that takes us to the end of September. They also issue a 3-week forecast. So this is technically week 2. Again, it's issued every Tuesday. And then as we widen the view again, you can see maybe a little bit of some minor development, low odds here back through the Gulf. But as we go into week 3, which now takes us October 1st to 7th, still just low odds here from the Cabo Verde Islands through the main development region, and a little bit of development here around Central America, again in the Western Caribbean, and over towards the Gulf of Mexico. So even though we have Gabrielle out there and we have that one area that we're watching, not a lot of signs in some of the long-range computer models that there's going to be a lot more of activity out into the Atlantic, at least through the first week of October. Things can certainly change. It's been a quiet season, but things can certainly change, and that's something we'll have to watch as we get into the middle of October. Of course, hurricane season runs through the end of November. You can have tropical systems outside of hurricane season. That's not unheard of, but really for the eastern half of the United States, certainly for us here in Virginia and North Carolina, once you get through about mid-October, those chances for impactful storms start to go down, and you start to look more, again, towards the Caribbean and the Gulf. Doesn't mean it can't happen. And of course, sometimes we start to get some of those hybrid systems, like we had a nor'easter and Ida a few years ago, and nor'easters, coastal storms, can do just as much damage. Of course, this past week we had that little bit of a coastal low, almost a mini nor'easter that brought 7 inches of rain, 8 inches of rain towards Virginia Beach, caused some flooding, and caused one of the houses in Buxton to go into the water. So again, a lot can happen, even though there's just low odds right now for tropical development here in the Atlantic. So that takes care of the Atlantic. Let's head over to the Pacific now, because the Pacific has been very active this year. We've had numerous tropical systems, and there is one area that we're watching here off the coast of Mexico. Once again, looking at about an 80 to 90% chance of development with this system here off the coast of Mexico. It looks like it'll stay off the coast of Mexico. Of course, we had Mario, which is now bringing some heavy rain, the remnants of Mario, towards the desert Southwest and the southwestern United States. But this is the next system that has the potential for development here in the eastern Pacific. And I don't know why we went there to Gabrielle, but we'll go back here. These are the names of the storms in the Pacific. I mentioned Mario. Our next storm in the Pacific is Narda. So if that system develops, and again, we're looking at an 80 to 90% chance of development, the next name on the list is Narda. And then you see we have Octave and Priscilla and go to Raymond. Of course, the Pacific hurricane season starts a little bit before. The Atlantic starts on May 15th, but it has really been an active season in the Pacific. So for now, that's the latest from the Hurricane Hub Live. I'm 13 News Now meteorologist Evan Stewart. Make sure to join us here for Hurricane Hub Live every day at 8 p.m.